The banker's voice echoed through the polished marble hall, dripping with disdain as he belittled a man who had once worn a uniform and risked his life on foreign soil. To the onlookers, the veteran seemed small, fragile even, standing there in his worn-out jacket, clutching papers that told of battles fought decades ago. But behind those tired eyes was a story no banker could ever measure in currency: sacrifice, courage, and scars etched deeper than any balance sheet. The humiliation he endured that day was not just a slight against him, but against every sacrifice he had ever made for the very society that now looked down on him. The room had fallen silent, some patrons averting their eyes, unwilling to confront the injustice unfolding before them. Yet a few remained transfixed, sensing that what they were witnessing was more than an old soldier being dismissed by a man with wealth and arrogance. It was the clashing of two worlds, one built on honor and the other on greed. The banker smirked, certain of his power, certain that his title and influence made him untouchable. He had no idea that the very man he ridiculed would soon teach him a lesson he would never forget. This veteran was not just any passerby seeking a loan or favor. He carried with him stories of nights spent in the trenches, brothers lost on foreign ground, and promises whispered under gunfire. He understood resilience in a way no banker could ever comprehend. To him, every insult was another battlefield, another test of his endurance. And though he left the bank that day with his pride bruised, his silence carried the weight of something greater, an impending reckoning. As the banker celebrated his petty victory, unaware of the whispers his cruelty had stirred, fate was already weaving its threads. The veteran, humbled but not broken, was about to reveal a side of his life that no one in that room could have imagined. Sometimes, true strength is not loud, not immediate, but patient, waiting for the perfect moment to rise. And when it does, it shakes the foundations of arrogance to the core. What no one could predict was how quickly tables would turn. The man mocked as powerless was holding a card that would unravel the banker's world of polished lies and fragile superiority. This was not merely about revenge. It was about restoring dignity, about reminding everyone watching that day that respect is earned, not bought. The stage was set, and soon the world would see what happens when a war veteran decides to fight back. Not with weapons, but with something far more devastating: truth. The days following the humiliation at the bank weighed heavily on the veteran's mind, but he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had seen him through darker days. He had been insulted before, but never so publicly, never in a place that claimed to serve the very community he had once fought to protect. Each word from the banker echoed like shrapnel in his memory, cutting deeper with every replay. Yet beneath that pain was a burning ember, an unyielding determination not to let this act of arrogance define him. Neighbors who heard whispers of the incident were outraged, but the veteran remained calm. He had endured far worse than mockery: nights of hunger, moments of despair, and the loss of brothers in arms who would never return home. Compared to that, the banker's cruelty seemed small, though no less bitter. People began to notice his silence, a silence not of defeat, but of patience, and in their eyes, respect for the old soldier grew stronger. Behind closed doors, however, the banker boasted of his triumph. To his colleagues, he bragged about putting the veteran in his place, laughing at how the man had stood there, powerless. His arrogance blinded him to the storm quietly brewing. For him, the encounter was nothing more than a footnote in his daily routine, a tale to inflate his ego. But in reality, that moment had ignited a chain of events that would eventually dismantle the very pedestal he stood upon. The veteran had always lived by the code of service: honor above wealth, integrity above comfort. While the banker flaunted his fortune, the soldier drew strength from memories of sacrifice and resilience. Those who knew him best understood that when he chose silence, it was not surrender, it was preparation. He had no intention of retaliating with rage. His method would be precise, deliberate, and far more devastating than a shouted insult. In the heart of the community, whispers spread like wildfire. People recalled favors the veteran had done, the times he had quietly stepped in to help a neighbor, or the stories he shared of battles fought for freedoms many took for granted. As those whispers grew, so did the sense that justice, though delayed, was inevitable. The banker thought he had silenced a man. In truth, he had given that man a voice louder than he could ever imagine. 1 week later, an announcement appeared in the local paper that would alter the course of events. The veteran, once overlooked, was scheduled to be honored at a community gathering for his service in the war. The town hall would open its doors to celebrate his sacrifices, and leaders of the community, including business owners and city officials, were expected to attend. The banker scoffed at the news, dismissing it as another charity gesture. He had no idea that this gathering would be the very stage where his arrogance would unravel. As the day drew closer, anticipation filled the air. Families prepared banners, children rehearsed songs of gratitude, and neighbors polished speeches to honor the man who had given so much. The veteran himself remained humble, insisting he did not deserve such recognition. Yet, deep down, he knew that this was not just about him. It was about dignity, about showing that respect cannot be stripped away by a single insult. He accepted the honor, not for himself alone, but for every soldier who had been forgotten. The night of the event arrived, and the hall was packed with people eager to celebrate the veteran's story. When he entered, the room erupted in applause, a sound that echoed through the rafters. For a moment, he felt transported back to the days when comrades stood by his side, united in purpose. The warmth of the crowd washed over him, melting the sting of the banker's mockery. But the most striking detail was not the applause. It was the sight of the banker himself, seated uncomfortably in the front row, forced by social obligation to attend. The veteran stepped onto the stage, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He began to speak, his voice steady and filled with quiet strength. He spoke not of battles or medals, but of sacrifice, of nights when hope was the only weapon, and of promises made to those who never returned. Every word gripped the audience, pulling them deeper into the raw truth of his journey. Even the banker, who had once sneered at him, sat frozen, unable to escape the gravity of the story unfolding before him. What the banker did not know was that the veteran's speech was only the beginning. The stage was not just a place of recognition. It was the opening act of a revelation that would expose truths the banker had long kept buried. The crowd, enraptured by the soldier's words, was unknowingly being prepared for a moment that would shift their perception forever. And as the speech came to a close, the silence that followed carried with it a sense that something monumental was about to happen. The silence in the hall lingered, heavy and expectant, as the veteran lowered his notes and let his gaze sweep over the audience. He paused deliberately, allowing the weight of his words to settle into the hearts of those before him. Then, with the same calmness that had carried him through firefights long ago, he shifted his speech. No longer was it only about sacrifice or remembrance. It was about accountability. He spoke of values, of integrity, and of how the true wealth of a man is measured not by the numbers in his account, but by the legacy of his actions. At first, the crowd listened with admiration, nodding as though they were absorbing timeless wisdom. But as the veteran's words sharpened, the tone shifted. He described the poison of arrogance, the cruelty of belittling those who had given everything for their country, and the shame of valuing prestige over humanity. Though he never named the banker directly, every person in the hall knew exactly to whom he was referring. The banker shifted uneasily in his seat, the confidence that once defined him now slipping through his fingers. The veteran then shared the story of the bank encounter, every detail laid bare before the crowd. He recounted how he was mocked for his worn jacket, how his service meant nothing to the man who measured respect only in wealth. Gasps filled the hall, mothers shaking their heads in disbelief, fathers clenching their fists in anger. The banker's face reddened, but he forced himself to remain seated, trapped by the weight of his own actions now echoing back at him. Yet the soldier's voice carried no bitterness, no malice. He spoke with restraint, with a dignity that contrasted sharply against the banker's cruelty. The contrast itself was damning. The crowd could feel it in their bones. They were not witnessing a man's revenge, but a man's unwavering commitment to truth. And in that truth, the banker's carefully polished mask began to crack. He could no longer hide behind his title or his wealth. He was exposed. When the veteran stepped away from the podium, The hall erupted into applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the very walls. The sound was not merely for him. It was a collective declaration of where the community stood. The banker had entered that hall believing he was untouchable, but as he sat in the front row, drowning in the applause that celebrated the very man he had humiliated, he realized that his power was nothing more than an illusion. The banker left the hall that night with his head down, a stark contrast to the swagger he carried when entering. For the first time in years, he felt small, and the whispers that followed him through the streets pierced deeper than any financial loss ever could. People who once fawned over his wealth now looked at him with disappointment, with judgment. His name, once a symbol of influence, was now a shadow of shame whispered in every corner of town. But humiliation was only the beginning. The veteran's story spread beyond the walls of that hall, carried from neighbor to neighbor, until it reached the local press. Articles appeared, headlines praising the soldier's courage to speak truth to power. The narrative shifted quickly. The banker was no longer a man of prestige, but a cautionary tale of arrogance brought low. Each article eroded the foundation of his influence, turning the very community he had manipulated into his harshest critics. As the weeks passed, clients began to reconsider their loyalty to the banker's institution. Families who once trusted him with their savings withdrew their accounts, choosing instead to support smaller, humbler establishments. Business partners distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association with a man whose reputation had become toxic. What had begun as a single insult had snowballed into a collapse, unraveling years of carefully crafted dominance. Meanwhile, the veteran found himself embraced more deeply by the community than ever before. Children stopped him on the streets to thank him, neighbors visited to share their gratitude, and strangers offered help he never asked for. He did not bask in the attention. His life had taught him humility, but he accepted it with quiet grace. For him, the true victory was not in the banker's downfall, but in the restoration of something far greater: respect for those who had given without expecting anything in return. Yet beneath the surface, a deeper reckoning loomed. The banker, though cornered and humiliated, was not a man to accept defeat quietly. Pride can be more dangerous than greed, and his pride, now wounded, began to twist into something darker. He plotted in silence, convinced that he could still reclaim what he had lost. The veteran's story was far from over. The battle between honor and arrogance had only just begun. The banker's attempts to regain his lost stature began quietly, behind closed doors. He met with allies who shared his wealth and influence, whispering strategies to undermine the veteran's newfound respect. They plotted ways to twist public opinion, spreading rumors and half-truths to diminish the soldier's accomplishments. Yet, no amount of scheming could replicate the authenticity of the veteran's story. Every lie they planted seemed to wither under the sunlight of truth, exposing them as desperate and hollow. The veteran, aware of the growing whispers but unconcerned, continued living as he always had, humble, steadfast, and unyielding. He never retaliated. His strength lay not in confrontation, but in patience. Friends and neighbors rallied around him, drawn not just to his courage, but to the unwavering integrity he displayed. The more the banker tried to manipulate the narrative, the more the community clung to the story of resilience and honor that could not be bought or silenced. Meanwhile, the banker grew increasingly reckless, attempting grand gestures to reclaim attention. He hosted lavish events, invited influential figures, and flaunted his wealth in ways that had once commanded respect. But the community saw through it all. They recognized the desperation beneath the surface, the cracks in his once impenetrable armor. The more he tried to dominate, the smaller he seemed, until his efforts became a spectacle of futility. One day, a chance encounter brought the banker face to face with the veteran outside the very bank where the humiliation had first occurred. The veteran greeted him with a simple nod, calm and unshaken, while the banker fumbled for words, his arrogance replaced by discomfort. In that moment, it was clear: true power was not measured in wealth or status, but in character, in the ability to endure suffering and maintain dignity. The veteran's quiet strength had spoken louder than any of the banker's ostentatious displays. The encounter became the turning point for many who had doubted the veteran's quiet influence. Witnesses shared the story far and wide, marveling at the contrast between humility and arrogance, patience and recklessness. The banker, once untouchable, was now defined by his failures, while the veteran became a living testament to the principle that true respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. This lesson resonated deeply with the entire community, shaping perceptions and behaviors in ways that would last for generations. As weeks turned into months, the veteran's reputation grew not just locally but regionally. Letters of admiration arrived from strangers, recounting how his story inspired courage and integrity in their own lives. Social gatherings frequently included his presence, not as a curiosity, but as a symbol of endurance and honor. He became a living reminder that dignity and morality were more enduring than wealth or influence, and that even the smallest acts of courage could resonate far beyond immediate circumstances. The banker, meanwhile, sank deeper into isolation. His attempts to regain influence became increasingly erratic, each effort only highlighting his desperation. He struggled to maintain relationships, both personal and professional, as the shadow of the veteran's quiet triumph loomed ever larger. People began avoiding his offices, choosing instead to celebrate those who had shown true courage and selflessness. The community had collectively shifted its loyalty, gravitating toward honesty and authenticity, leaving arrogance and cruelty behind. In this unfolding narrative, the veteran's life itself became a lesson in resilience. Every neighbor, every friend, every stranger he encountered witnessed how patience and integrity could overcome even the most arrogant of adversaries. He demonstrated that victory did not always require confrontation or aggression. Sometimes, endurance, quiet strength, and unwavering values were enough to transform the world around him. His journey was proof that justice could unfold naturally, without force, when guided by truth. Even the banker, now a shell of his former self, could not ignore the profound influence the veteran held over the community. It was no longer about a single humiliation of the bank, but about a living legacy of respect and moral authority. In every conversation, in every interaction, the contrast was stark. One man wielded wealth to dominate, while the other wielded character to inspire. And over time, the latter became far more powerful than anyone could have anticipated. Yet the story was far from over. Beneath the surface of the banker's failures, a lingering sense of resentment remained, a dangerous seed that could one day sprout into further conflict. The veteran, ever aware of this possibility, remained vigilant, guided not by fear but by foresight. He understood that true courage was not just in enduring immediate trials, but in preparing for challenges yet unseen, in standing firm no matter what storms might come. The veteran's presence in the town became more than symbolic. It became transformative. Schools began inviting him to speak with students, hoping his words would instill values of resilience and humility in the younger generation. His stories were not filled with glory or grandeur, but with raw honesty, tales of fear, sacrifice, and the courage to endure. The children listened, wide-eyed, realizing that heroism was not about power or prestige, but about the willingness to serve others selflessly. Parents watched with pride, grateful that their children were learning from a man who embodied integrity. The banker, on the other hand, grew increasingly embittered by the veteran's rising influence. Each headline, each story shared in admiration, felt like salt rubbed into an unhealed wound. He could not bear the thought of being overshadowed by a man he once mocked. In his frustration, he began making reckless business decisions, attempting to outshine the veteran with displays of wealth and authority. But his desperation only pushed people further away, exposing him as a man consumed by pride and envy. Community leaders, once aligned with the banker's wealth, started shifting their allegiance toward the veteran, not because of money or influence, but because his example represented something enduring, something people longed to follow. Meetings once dominated by the banker's voice were now filled with discussions inspired by the veteran's message: honor, compassion, and accountability. The tide had turned completely, and the banker found himself a relic of a past that no longer held power. In private, the The veteran reflected on how life had brought him to this point. He had never sought recognition, nor had he ever dreamed of becoming a symbol for others. His battles had been fought long ago on distant fields, and he had returned home expecting only peace. Yet fate had chosen him once more, not for combat, but for a different kind of war. A war of values, where his greatest weapons were patience and truth. The banker, however, refused to yield. His resentment festered like an open wound, and he began seeking allies outside the community, men of equal greed and arrogance, hoping to rebuild his crumbling empire. He believed he could still manipulate circumstances in his favor, still reclaim the dominance he had lost. What he failed to understand was that once people had tasted truth, they would never again be blinded by lies. His downfall was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. One evening, as the veteran walked home from a gathering, he was stopped by a group of townspeople who presented him with a simple yet powerful gift, a plaque engraved with the words, "True honor is eternal." They explained that it was not just for him, but for what he represented, the idea that humility and sacrifice would always outshine arrogance and greed. The veteran accepted the plaque with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the love and respect that surrounded him. It was a moment that etched itself into the town's memory, a symbol of unity born from struggle. News of this event reached beyond the community, spreading into neighboring towns, and even catching the attention of regional leaders. The veteran was invited to share his story at larger gatherings, where people from all walks of life listened intently. His words carried a universal message that transcended the humiliation he had suffered, that dignity cannot be stripped away by insults, and that respect is built on actions, not possessions. Everywhere he went, people stood in awe of the quiet strength that radiated from him. The banker watched from a distance, his bitterness growing into obsession. He could no longer deny that he had lost the admiration of the community, but he convinced himself that this wave of respect for the veteran would eventually fade. He clung to the belief that people were fickle, that wealth would always reclaim power in the end. Yet deep down, he feared that he was wrong. He feared that the man he once ridiculed had awakened something far more powerful than money could ever buy. The veteran, though celebrated, never let pride take root in his heart. He remained the same man, visiting old friends, helping neighbors, and living simply. To him, recognition was not the victory. The true triumph was seeing his community embrace values he had long held dear. He knew life was fragile, that honor could only be preserved through constant vigilance. And so, while others saw him as a hero, he saw himself only as a servant to something greater than himself. Still, there was a quiet tension lingering in the air, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The veteran sensed it in the unease of certain conversations, in the bitter glances cast by those who still aligned themselves with the banker. Though he had no desire for further conflict, he understood that life rarely allowed peace to last. And when the storm finally broke, he would face it with the same courage that had carried him through every battlefield before. The storm arrived sooner than anyone expected. Late one afternoon, a scandal erupted when documents leaked from the banker's own office revealed years of deceit, predatory loans, hidden fees, and schemes that had drained families of their savings. What once had been whispered suspicions was now undeniable truth. The community reacted with outrage, their anger sharper than ever before. The banker had not only mocked a veteran, he had preyed upon the very people who had once trusted him most. Crowds gathered outside the bank, demanding accountability. Former clients stepped forward, sharing stories of exploitation and loss, their voices weaving a damning chorus of betrayal. For the first time in his life, the banker found himself cornered, not by a competitor or a rival, but by the collective will of the people. The empire he had built on arrogance and greed was crumbling in real time, and there was no escape. His wealth could no longer shield him, and his influence had evaporated like mist under the sun. In the midst of this chaos, the veteran was asked to speak once more, not as a victim, but as a voice of reason. Standing before the angry crowd, he did not call for vengeance or hatred. Instead, he urged unity, reminding everyone that justice must come through truth and accountability, not blind rage. His words calmed the gathering, transforming their fury into resolve. The people wanted change, and, under his guidance, they sought it with dignity rather than destruction. The contrast between the two men was now undeniable. On one side stood the banker, trembling, stripped of power, and exposed as a fraud. On the other stood the veteran, steady and composed, carrying himself with the quiet strength of someone who had endured much and asked for little. The town realized that the real measure of greatness was not in the size of a fortune, but in the depth of one's character. That night, as the banker sat alone in his lavish but empty home, he could hear the echoes of the crowd celebrating the veteran's wisdom and leadership. It was a sound he could not silence, a haunting reminder of how far he had fallen. The tables had turned completely, and his downfall was now complete. In the weeks that followed, the banker's empire collapsed entirely. Regulators intervened, lawsuits mounted, and partners abandoned him. The once proud figure who had humiliated a war veteran now lived in disgrace, his wealth reduced, and his reputation in ruins. He was no longer feared, no longer admired, only pitied. His arrogance had built a fragile castle, and truth had shattered it brick by brick. The veteran, meanwhile, continued his life with the same humility as before. Though he became a symbol for the entire region, he never sought power or recognition. Instead, he used his newfound platform to advocate for fairness, respect, and compassion. Schools, charities, and civic groups rallied around him, eager to learn from a man who had endured both war and humiliation with dignity and emerged stronger for it. His story spread even further, carried by newspapers, radio programs, and word of mouth. To many, he became a living parable, proof that arrogance is fleeting, but honor is eternal. Strangers approached him not with pity, but with admiration, thanking him for showing them that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in values that cannot be bought. His life had become larger than his own struggles. It had become a beacon for others. The community itself transformed. Inspired by the veteran, people began to treat one another with greater respect. Acts of kindness multiplied, and conversations about accountability and honor filled public spaces. The veteran's resilience had not only brought down a corrupt man, but had lifted an entire community, reminding them of what truly mattered. And so, while the banker's name faded into infamy, the veteran's legacy endured. His story lived on, retold again and again as a warning against arrogance and as a celebration of dignity. He had entered the bank as a man humiliated, but he emerged from the trials as something far greater, a symbol of truth's quiet but unstoppable power. The story of the veteran and the banker is not just about humiliation and revenge. It is a mirror held up to society. It reveals how arrogance can blind a man to the value of true strength, and how dignity, though quiet, can echo louder than the most powerful voices. The veteran never sought recognition, yet he became a symbol of integrity. The banker, who believed wealth made him untouchable, discovered that character outlasts fortune every time. This tale reminds us that honor cannot be purchased, only earned. Every insult, every cruel word thrown at the veteran became fuel for a greater lesson. His patience, his endurance, and his refusal to descend into bitterness showed that sometimes the most profound victories are won not through anger, but through resilience. And while the banker's downfall was dramatic, it was not the center of the story. The true power lay in the veteran's ability to rise, to transform pain into purpose, and to stand as proof that justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied. Think about the community that watched all of this unfold. They saw firsthand how arrogance isolates and how humility unites. They saw a man stripped of dignity restored before their very eyes, not because he fought for recognition, but because he lived by values that resonated with every heart. It was not just a story of one man against another. It was a lesson about the world we all live in and the choices we make about the kind of people we want to be. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: who are we becoming in our own lives? Are we chasing after the fragile illusions of wealth and power, or are we building legacies rooted in respect and compassion? The veteran's story challenges us to reflect, to measure our worth not by what we possess, but by the values we carry and the way we treat others. That reflection is not meant to condemn, but to awaken something greater within us. If this story moved you, Take a moment to share your thoughts below. What part resonated with you most? Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that will inspire and challenge you. And if you believe more people should hear this lesson, give the video a like so it reaches those who may need it most. Because sometimes, one story is enough to change the way we see the world, and perhaps even ourselves.